So welcome, everyone. Is this working? Just need to move it closer. There you go. Okay, well, welcome to the last session here at International Law Weekend 2024. You've almost made it, and we're so grateful that you stayed in here with us because several of us actually started our entire children's rights careers in armed conflict situations. And to be able to wrap up this discussion by revisiting where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going is an opportunity that we're deeply grateful for. Joining us today in this roundtable is Ezekiel Hefes. Ezekiel is the director of Watch List on Children in Armed Conflict. We also have Ayana Sismus, who is a professor at York Law School and the co-director of the Applied Human Rights Center. We have Rocco Bloom, who is the head of advocacy at War Child. Alison Dundas Rentman, who will be talking to us about the cultural rights of children in war. And she is a professor of both anthropology and political science at the University of Southern California. And we have Michael Garcia Bohenick, who is the senior counsel at Human Rights Watch in the Children's Rights Division. My name is Warren Binford, and I am a co-chair of International Law Weekend, and I'm so grateful for everyone's willingness to serve on this roundtable. I wanted to start with a question to Rocco. How does armed conflict contribute to the vulnerability of children, and what are the unique harms that children experience in the armed conflict context?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Oops. Like everyone else, I have to ask, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can, very good. So thank you. It's good to be asked the first question of the session. I should just introduce briefly War Child. We're a humanitarian organization. We work in 14 countries affected by conflict and recovering from conflict. And we provide education, mental health and psychosocial support and child protection services. So to your question, in stable contexts, in stable societies, we see that children are surrounded by layers of protection. So primarily that would be the family, the immediate family, the extended family, the schools that children go to. They have access to teachers, friends. They're surrounded by people who have the opportunity to look out for their well-being, for the most part. In the worst situations when children face neglect and abuse, there are often systems, formal systems, social services, or informal systems that can pick up on those challenges, and they can provide some kinds of solutions. I again say, for the most part, this is the case. But in conflict situations, especially in protracted conflicts, we see those layers of protection stripped away. So that might be because schools are no longer accessible. Parents have to go out to work. A child might have to go out to work long hours. They're put in situations where they're increasingly vulnerable. And then at the peak of disruption or the peak of conflict, they are exposed to extreme risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse. And in the work that War Child does, we work with children who are recruited and used by armed groups. We support them to be reintegrated back into their communities. We work with children who are on the street. And those are some of the most vulnerable children of all, those children that have no one around them who are looking out for their best interest. So what does War Child do? To that question, we provide services. We have a very functional operational role providing child protection education services. An example is in displaced persons camps and refugee camps. We will often set up child-friendly spaces. So these big tents that are brightly colored, full of warm, kind of comforting images and pictures. Children will go to them and they will have a space to recover, to be made more resilient, being around friends. They have some education activities, play activities. And it's also an opportunity for us to assess the children who have acute mental health needs, and then where possible to refer them on. We work with children leaving armed groups to reintegrate them into their communities. And we do child reunification activities to reunite children with their parents where they're separated. But I would make a very strong point that humanitarian agencies are only ever able to do the minimum in any context. The much more important element of our work is what we call the rights-based approach, or implementing a rights-based approach, working with civilians, with children to support them to understand their rights and to work with state authorities to build their understanding of their obligations and their willingness and capacity to fulfill those obligations. So this is the most long-term sustainable way in which we're able to support the realization of rights. It may not always be possible. We may work with authorities who are antagonistic towards communities. They may not want to acknowledge those rights. That doesn't mean those rights don't exist. So we maintain activities where and how we can. I would stop there. I think those are the main points.
Okay, thank you so much, Rocco. Ilana, when you submitted a proposal to, with others in the roundtable to present at the conference, there was another proposal that also had been submitted about children in war, and we were asked to combine our proposals. And what caught me off guard about your proposal is that you talked about beyond compliance, and it wasn't a term that I was familiar with. I didn't really understand that. Can you tell us a little bit about what does that mean? What does beyond compliance mean? And what would that look like in a real world situation?
Thank you very much, Warren, and thank you for having us on the panel. We're three actually in the Beyond Compliance Consortium, which I lead. It's a consortium formed of 3 universities, York, Glasgow, and Utrecht, and 6 humanitarian and human rights organizations. Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict and War Child are 2 of those organizations. What we do, we started our program of work. It's a co-productive program of work with humanitarians, academics, but also with people with lived experience of armed conflict. We started our work in February 2024, and we're funded by the UK government for 3 years. We work in 9 conflict contexts, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to South Sudan, to Syria, Yemen, DRC, Colombia. So we're covering a lot of Ukraine. We're covering a lot of difficult contexts. So this was an accountable grant that we applied for, and beyond compliance doesn't mean it doesn't mean we're bypassing the law. It means that we are looking at the law as one of the strategies to address harm and need on the ground, but we don't start from the law. So our starting point, our analysis in research, and we argue as well as in programming and policy making and interventions by governments and non-state armed groups, should really start with the everyday lived reality in armed conflict. So it should start with the harm that is experienced by people on the ground in different types of conflicts, protracted armed conflict that lasts for decades, but also at the height of conflicts, what we see in Ukraine or Gaza or Sudan right now. And it should also start with an understanding of how civilian harm connects with humanitarian need. We're taking an approach to harm and need that broadens these terms, combines them and broadens them by removing the term civilian from civilian harm and humanitarian from needs in order to enlarge the scope of what's covered through this composite concept. So what we do is enlarge the personal scope. That is, we're looking not just at civilians, but we're also looking at specific categories of vulnerable fighters and combatants, child soldiers, for example, but also women fighters who are affected differently within armed groups themselves. We're also enlarging the material scope of harm and need by looking at the composite concept. We tend to think in terms of killing when we're talking about armed conflict and civilian harm. But very often the reality on the ground is one of loss of livelihood, one of gendered impacts, one on impacts on children that have lost their families, as we have heard, that are long-term, that are generational. So we're also expanding the temporal scope and the geographical scope of harm and need by so we're not looking at just events, we're looking at pre-conflict, during conflict, and post-conflict, the structures that aid to the situation of conflict. Okay, so starting with this empirical reality, then we look at, okay, what can the law solve? IHL primarily, but also human rights law. And what we see is that the law can solve a lot of things, or theoretically can solve a lot of things, but it simply doesn't regulate all the harms and needs on the ground. So for instance, under international human rights law and IHL, conscription as such, not of children, not forced, is not a violation. Yet it has an immense impact. We see it in Ukraine, we see it in Myanmar, we see it in other places. It has an immense gendered impact, for example, and it has an immense and differentiated impact on children. So that's not regulated, but that doesn't mean that that harm and the need arising doesn't exist on the ground. So what other strategies exist, therefore, extra legal sometimes? It could be developmental, it could be political strategies such as calls for a ceasefire. It could be restraint from violence and abuse. These are all strategies alongside compliance that we can draw on. So by starting from the empirical reality as opposed to starting from the legal lens, we unmask basically what the law invisibilizes. That's what beyond compliance means. What's really interesting is that the concept of beyond compliance was taken up in May of this year by the Protection of Civilians report of the UN Secretary General, which was wonderful for us to see. We started the project a bit earlier. But we also see that there is a wider understanding of the necessity to look at other strategies in addition to the law, because the law is being either disrespected or politicized. So what is compliant has become so politicized that sometimes we might actually achieve better results on the ground if we rely on extra legal strategies. Not always. Right. What's my last point is that in the arena of
Ilona,
children,
could you speak closer into the mic?
yes, sorry. In the arena of children and armed conflict, we have, in fact, and I'm sure Ezekiel is going to talk more about this, we have examples of this harm and need approach and beyond compliance approach. The 6 grave violations are, in fact, such a beyond compliance approach. They do draw on IHL, they draw on international human rights law, but they go beyond that. So under IHL, the destruction of schools is not always a violation, yet that is a grave violation. So it's interesting to see that we are now conceptualizing something that has been commonsensically applied in certain areas. And what we're trying to do with the project is to see if we are using this broader conceptualization in other areas, where do we get with it? What are the implications for the law, but also for practical protection on the ground?
So as a follow-up question, I always think about the law is the minimum of what we must do, you know, as participants in a society. This is the minimum that we must do. But then when I think about what we should do, I refer to it as the ethics of humanity. And so is there a parallel between beyond compliance and that framework? Is it essentially an ethical framework in an armed conflict context? Or if it's not, you know, how is it different?
Is that addressed to me? Or?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm usually projecting so well that I don't need microphones, but I think today is the exception. Must be jet lag. We don't actually think of it in terms of ethics. But it can absolutely be part of ethics. What we want to draw on is on local, So beyond the law in local context, it might be religion, for example. It might be certain understanding of values in specific local cultures. It might be feminist thought for some. It might be critical race theory for some. It might be common sense for others. Whatever works. We're very, in a sense, pragmatic. I would say this is a pragmatic approach. It can very well be ethics for some of us. I'm just concerned that if we are tagging it as the ethics of humanity, we risk closing the doors to some quarters. So for instance, part of what we're proposing, we see in very unexpected places. The Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan of the US military relies on moral standards and on, winning hearts and minds to win the war. And it is, in fact, a beyond compliance approach. The action plan itself, the directives that follow afterwards, narrow the scope of harm profoundly. So I wouldn't really like us to align necessarily with the ethics of hearts and minds. At the same time, that might be the direction that some of the partners, and it is in fact some of the actors active in this space, they are using this language.
So what I'm hearing from you is it's much more than ethics, but ethics can be a component of it, but you're reaching out to the other aspects of human life and experience that supersede the armed conflict and hopefully will survive the armed conflict. And, and so you've given the example of the philosophy or the political values of people who are, in this armed conflict, or, the philosophy, religion, political values, et cetera. So ethics can be a part of it, but it's just one part of a much broader approach that you take to look at all of their aspects of identity as human beings who are caught up in this armed conflict. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think the best example you would have had, I don't know how many of you have attended the panel on the Middle East, also known as Palestine and Lebanon, yesterday. And you would have observed that we had one speaker who came from a military background, and one of the two speakers who is a survivor with lived experience of armed conflict, who was telling us that her family is in Lebanon right now, in Beirut, and she's afraid for their life. And the discourse of those two people was actually overlapping much more than the discourse of our colleague who was an IHL lawyer on the same panel. So it's something that you can't necessarily touch. I think what is palpable is that if we start from the law only, we're invisibilizing certain experiences of armed conflict, and that's what we don't want to do. That's where we are at this stage with our conceptual framework. We have to test how that works in practice beyond the children conflict agenda.
Well, thank you so much for explaining that for us, Ilana, and for the work that all of you are doing in this field to try and take a broader approach to support people who are experiencing armed conflict. It actually takes me to you, Allison, because you, of course, focus, one of your areas of expertise is around cultural rights, including the cultural rights of children. And a lot of the research that's coming out right now on positive childhood experiences, which build resilience, shows that some of these cultural values and experiences that Ilana was talking about is in fact part of what builds resilience and helps children who grow into adults, whether they experience the trauma as children or whether they experience it as adults, that these, cultural experiences and other human experiences, such as tradition, can help build that strength and that resilience for children. And yet in the context of war, we often see a destruction of culture and cultural tradition. So can you tell us a little bit about, what children's cultural rights are, and particularly how those cultural rights might be affected in the armed conflict context?
How long do I have?
I just want to say thank you for including me. It's really an honor to be with so many advocate, human rights defenders and leaders and in this area. So the right to culture is part of human rights law, and people often wonder, well, what is culture? And it's a difficult thing to define, but it includes religion, language, foodways. George Peter Murdoch had an outline of cultural materials that outlined all of these. And I prefer to focus on specific customs rather than trying to get into a philosophical discussion of this. But I hope it's enough with this group of international lawyers to say that it is something that's recognized. The right to culture, though the most understudied of all human rights, is part of human rights law. And it's codified in various treaties. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is a very important formulation. Article 15 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which deals more with science and intellectual property rights. But one of the most important versions of cultural rights is defined in Article 30 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has been ratified by every country in the world, except embarrassingly, I have to say, the United States, and we need to rectify that. So there's a very detailed definition of the right to culture in that particular article. And then it's hard to put it briefly. So, but it covers the rights to language, religious practice, participation in sport, play. Article 31 talks about play. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child has provisions on this. I have been working lately at the World Bank, where the focus is on protecting cultural heritage during armed conflict under the 1954 Hague Convention and the two protocols. And then there are some declarations related to protecting civilians from attack. There's a political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And so I've been thinking about trying to help the World Bank incorporate cultural rights into their protection of cultural heritage in Gaza and the West Bank. And so I've been thinking a lot about children and what kinds of priorities there should be in terms of cultural heritage that would benefit children. So art, for example, art as therapy could be part of the hospitals, because cultural heritage is important, but other things are more important, like health and water and other things. But if schools are going to be reopened, then the curriculum, there could be books in languages, and then it could include things about cultural heritage. So I'm hoping to speak to some of you maybe after about how can we help children in places like Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon to enjoy their culture and find it to be empowering. Usually people, I wasn't really expecting that question, because usually people assume that the culture is something that's negative for children. And so a lot of the work of the United Nations has been to protect children from harmful traditional practices. So I often find myself in a position of trying to say, yes, there are some good things about culture, but I should acknowledge that there's some aspects of culture that are very harmful to children. And in the context of armed conflict, we've already heard about the child soldier, children being recruited to be part of armed conflict. There's also the issue of so-called bushwives, women supposedly being forced into marriage and sex slavery. So there's some aspects of culture that are not empowering. But I think if we're protecting children's rights, we have to deal with things like work and marriage. And so those are some of the topics that I think will arise both during armed conflict, but in other situations. So it's hard to answer the question, directly about how does culture empower children, because most of us acquire our cultural values unconsciously, and it's part of our identities. And so I think in armed conflict where people are so traumatized, and especially children, there need to be ways to help children during armed conflict to process the trauma. So the kinds of things I was thinking about would be making sure that you have interpreters so that children can express their sadness and their grief, and be able to communicate with maybe expatriates or other people. So having interpreters there to protect their cultural rights is an important way to empower children, and especially to allow them to communicate with healthcare professionals, people from the Red Cross. I think dealing with death and different rituals about treating the dead. There are different ways that people process grief, and so there would need to be culturally appropriate ways to help children in these situations. The only example I could think of really was in Africa, where people would want to hug people who had died, and where there was Ebola, that would be fatal. So, you know, protecting cultural rights is important, but not if it's at the expense of other kinds of human rights. So it seems as though dealing with trauma and the fear of it would require interpreters. I also wondered about a right of exit, because people who theorize about cultural rights talk about a right to culture, but also a right to exit from cultures that are harmful to them. And I haven't heard much, for example, about Gaza and the West Bank, whether children who've been removed have had the opportunity to exit. It seems like that should be a point of discussion if we're talking about cultural rights and children in armed conflict. I think I should probably stop, but I hope that partly answers your question, although not completely.
Thank you so much, Allison. So Michael, Allison's told us a little bit about the cultural rights of children generally, and specifically the ways that armed conflict might violate their cultural rights. Could you talk to us a little bit about other rights that children in armed conflict have, and what the legal framework is that we have internationally to protect those rights?
Yes, I know these microphones are really odd, so I'm again looking to people to see if we can, yeah. You know, what's been interesting, and I think if you were at, for example, Ann Skelton's talk, just the last session, you heard quite a good summary of the development of these norms. But I think what's relevant for this conversation is how we've moved from, first of all, a focus on child soldiers with an age initially of 15 during the established in IHL, the Geneva Conventions, to an age of 18. How we've then expanded to a concept of from child soldiers to the idea of use in conflict, getting at people who might be carrying things, people who might be used for sexual services, et cetera, to then the concept of children affected by, which is of course much broader. And each of the speakers we've heard from so far has talked about the many ways that children are affected by armed conflict. And I think it's all unfortunately quite obvious to us with the recent examples of Gaza, but also of Ukraine and other examples that are maybe less well known. I think what would be interesting to think about is sort of like to acknowledge that there are some gaps still in this framework. We heard about schools as one of them. Schools aren't a protected object in the way that hospitals are, or even that cultural objects should be, right? They don't get a distinctive emblem like the Red Crescent or the Red Cross or the green, you know, the equivalent for cultural objects. And yet it's possible to sort of like look through and say, right, in the combination of different rights that we think maybe already these are, I don't know. The problem is, of course, that during conflict, there may be laws of war that override the usual human rights that would apply always and everywhere, even though we remember that most human rights will continue to apply at all times, war or peace. And I guess what I mean is that by raising schools is that the fact that they can be converted into military, that they might be used by the military. Either there might be military storage of armaments, maybe soldiers might be stationed there. There might be a temporary use for some other purpose. And unfortunately, that does turn it possibly into a military objective. And so we've had to look for other ways of trying to get those schools to be, if not protected in law, at least respected somewhat in practice for the value they bring, because schools are a place where, of course, learning is carried out, where culture might be transmitted, where healthcare services might be delivered, where food is often delivered, and that will continue to be necessary after hostilities abate and hopefully after they end. If they're destroyed, if teachers are attacked and killed or have to flee the area, and of course, if students are killed and it's not safe for them to go to school, if the path to school is not safe, then all of these, then we're in a much worse place. And so initiatives like the Safe Schools Declaration, sort of voluntary standards where states are voluntarily committing to abide by an extra requirement, is something that we've had to look at in terms of trying to fill this gap. I guess just one more thing to wrap up the question here is, maybe I have two more things. Sorry about that. The thing I was going to say is that we've also, just as we've progressed from this idea of a narrow focus on children serving in militaries, child soldiers, to something broader, ultimately children affected by, we're also now thinking about in international standards, what happens afterwards. So the idea of rehabilitation, reintegration, that children who have served in militaries or otherwise been forced to do things in the course of the armed conflict should be primarily viewed as victims rather than as offenders. And an early sign of that is the Rome Statutes. It's really a jurisdictional rule not to take on board, not to consider children as part of the as part of the people that it will prosecute. But I think what we have now with much more recent, much more developed international standards is this real focus on rehabilitation and reintegration. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. That actually leads us to a question that I have for Ezekiel. Michael was talking about the both the recruitment and the conscription of children into armed forces. And I know you've worked quite a bit with armed actors in trying to persuade them to engage in this beyond compliance framework that your consortium is promoting. Could you tell us a little bit about how you do that? Does it work? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Warren, for this. Perhaps before delving into how armed actors operate and whether they engage on issues related to child protection or not, I mean, what are we seeing nowadays in terms of humanitarian crisis around the world? So, of course, the focus most of the time is on the Middle East right now. Last year, a few years ago, it was on Ukraine, Sudan, we have Myanmar, we have Mali, the Sahel region in general, we have Colombia. We have, of course, Syria and Yemen. So one particular, perhaps, point that we see is the number of conflicts and the number of actors. And I wanna perhaps make a point on this because it has been reported that more than 400 armed groups around the world, they are causing humanitarian concern. That means that some of them might be using and recruiting children in hostilities, some might be using schools for military purposes, or they might be taxing the population living under their control, or there might be looting healthcare centers that are nearby, or conducting military operations between them or against the armed forces or the police forces of states. So among those 400 groups, we have around 1/4, so 100 that are parties to what we call non-international conflict. That means that they have obligations under international humanitarian law. So we have heard about some of these obligations. So they cannot, for instance, deliberately attack civilians, deliberately attack schools, or occupy schools or use and recruit children in hostilities. That means that there is an international framework that applies in times of armed conflict and binds both states and non-state armed groups for them not to do certain actions. Now, in addition to see that, what we see is that there is obviously a problem of lack of compliance. So when we think about armed actors, we see that some armed actors, indeed, they violate some of the rules that are applicable upon them. And I say some of the rules because there is also a tendency to say international humanitarian law is not respected. And I always make this comment, this nuance that some rules of international humanitarian law in armed conflict might not be respected others might be respected. So the focus is on the general legal framework, but actually when we see how armed actors operate on the ground, we see that there is much more than meets the eye. So the first one is in terms of, yes, there is lack of compliance of certain rules, and I'm going to delve into that in a few moments. There is respect as well with certain rules and commitment to respect to certain rules. And that happens not only with respect to non-state armed groups, but also with respect to states. Again, we see that there is an assumption of thinking like state armed forces, there's structure, there's the command and control, it works. And you know, they're respectful of international law, international humanitarian law, they don't commit violations. That's actually not the case. In many conflict situations, we see violations both by non-state armed groups and by state armed forces. In several of these situations, state armed forces belong to fragile state institutions. So the command and control, the internal enforcement of the rules within those structures is very weak. And I'm making that, I'm sharing the scene to say that in this setting, there are different reasons why parties respect and why parties violate the law. So when thinking about why they violate the law, and one of the reasons is, of course, there is a lack of willingness to respect some of these rules. And this is obvious, you know, some actors deliberately decide to violate some rules of international law, to torture enemies who have been detained, to attack certain civilian objects, to deliberately attack a group of civilians because they belong to a different ethnic group, for instance. So this obviously happens. But again, when we go a bit more into detail, we see that, for instance, there is a widespread lack of knowledge of international law. So in any given society, the circle of people who is aware of the law is very small. The circle of people who is aware of international law is smaller. The circle of people who is aware of international humanitarian law is smaller. And the circle of people who is aware of the differences between IHL, human rights law, and international criminal law, you can imagine that is tiny. So when we think about members of state armed forces in a fragile context, or members of non-state armed groups that are, you know, have a weak chain of command, most of the time they don't know the law. So if we start discussing about what's the minimum age for use and recruitment, and I ask everyone here, some people might say it's 15 years old because the Rome Statute says that below 15 is a war crime. Other people are going to say 18 because the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that 18 is the age when someone becomes an adult. Let's ask this question to members of armed groups in context where they think that a child becomes an adult when that person can start working in the field. They're going to say 13, 14. You know, it's very different. So there is an issue of lack of knowledge. Then there is also an issue of lack of capacity and organization. So I've been in touch with armed groups around the world. And, you know, again, you have a chat with the commander of the group. They accept that they're going to stop using or recruiting children in hostilities, stop occupying schools. And then how that order translates internally into the group, that's a different story. So the commander might engage with the humanitarian sector, but then how that internalizes within the group, it's quite different. So what do we do in this respect? And this is perhaps the issue of engagement that I want to delve into. Perhaps the last point is interpretation. Again, for certain actors, you know, they don't necessarily say, no, they don't want to respect or protect children. But then when you ask, again, how old a child should be, then there is a difference between what international law says and what they think. So what do we do with that? So certain organizations, they have taken steps to directly engage with parties from conflict. So they identify some of these issues that I mentioned before. Lack of knowledge. How do we solve this? We disseminate the law. So literally, we deliver trainings to commanders and armed structures and other potentially influential actors about the content of the law. So we say international law says that below 15 is a war crime, and you know, and the optional protocol, you know, and the differences between state and non-state actors. I mean, we disseminate the law with the expectation that an increased knowledge of the law will lead to better results on the ground. But that should be complemented to other initiatives. So not just dissemination of the law, but also even sitting down with actors that might be of influence. You know, when we think about how states and non-state armed groups operate in armed conflict, they do not operate in isolation. They come from communities. They relate with local communities. They talk to communities. They talk to religious leaders. In certain places, religious leaders have a great influence over how armed actors operate. So again, in this idea of engagement, not only we talk to the armed actors to increase their knowledge of the law, but also we try to identify who these influential actors might be, and also try to talk to them about international law. And the last point is to try to find similarities between what their local laws or local customs say with what international law says. So, and again, this has been a push in the past few years. And just want to finalize by saying that armed actors have, on occasions, engaged on international law. Obviously, states have ratified international treaties that are applicable in armed conflict. They have adopted military orders internally that are aligned with international law. Armed groups have done the same, not international treaties, because how international law is built, they cannot ratify international treaties, but they have signed commitments with the UN, with NGOs. They have also came out with unilateral declarations, with codes of conduct that are respectful or aligned with international law. And this has happened across the globe in many different contexts. So yes, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, of course, I want to follow up because Ezekiel, both you and Michael have brought up the Rome Statute.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a topic that came up both during the Emerging Voices session at the beginning, which is the need to integrate human rights law and humanitarian law. It's something that Ann Skelton talked about in her keynote today. And we're also weaving in international law. And you're talking about going out and meeting with these armed actors and saying, hey, this is what the law is. And I wonder if when you ever talk to them, if you talk to them about the fact that the ICC's first prosecution and some of its most high profile cases has targeted people, armed actors who have recruited children, both as child soldiers, as well as, committing sexual violence against children. And I know that that was an issue that was brought up in the question in the previous session about, we talk a lot about child soldiers, but we don't talk a lot about sexual violence against children, which tends to increase in many armed conflicts. So do you ever bring up the ICC's, the International Criminal Court's prosecution? And does that have any effect on the armed actors that you're trying to persuade to do the right thing?
It's a great question. So perhaps if I go back to it, I think it's the main question is why non-state armed groups might decide to respect international law. And there is an issue of legitimacy. So certain armed groups, they don't want to be perceived as criminals in nature, either with respect to the international community. So they don't want to be perceived as terrorists. They don't want to be included in terrorist organizations list that states or international organizations have. And with respect to the local communities, perhaps they come from those communities and they don't want to commit abuses or sexual violent cases against the children from those communities. With respect to the ICC, I would say it depends on the actor. So some actors, the whole idea of the fear of the prosecution as a deterrent effect with respect to these actors depends a lot on context. In certain contexts, they might not care about the future, which means that they don't care about whether they're going to be prosecuted in a few years before a local or an international tribunals. In other contexts, they might care about this. But generally, what I would say is they don't know about the ICC. So it's like, let's start from before, and they don't know whether the ICC can prosecute them. So I go back, again, I don't want to generalize, in certain contexts, because there have been cases against nationals for those contexts. They know or they have heard about this, but they might not know the nuances of the cases. So the first step is to disseminate this as well.
Thank you so much, Ezekiel. Rocco, that brings me to you. We've talked a little bit about armed groups who are trying to gain legitimacy in the international community and can be persuaded perhaps to make better decisions in pursuit of legitimacy. What about established states? Powerful states, what can they be doing to try and respect the rights of children in the context of armed conflict?
We have a large advocacy team, and we're engaging with powerful states all the time, arguing for different things. So in terms of what powerful states can deliver, one thing can be funding. So the types of programming we're talking about that protect children are always underfunded. There's been an increase in global humanitarian need, a relative decrease in international funding. So there are always different types of interventions that can be funded much better. But that's probably the easy part. It's the diplomatic engagement and the compliance with obligations. which is the most difficult thing. And I think over the last 2 days, this conference has done an extremely good job in exposing the flaws and faults where that's not happening and how that's creating a erosion in legitimacy across the globe, really, in international law. So in terms of complying with law, delivering on obligations, the starting point is to implement its commitments to IHL and international human rights law. I'm very glad, Michael, that you described the soft law instruments that exist, because in a way they go beyond compliance as well. And you talked about the Safe Schools Declaration. The Paris Principles is that instrument that pushes forward an understanding that children aren't, that should be considered as victims of grave violations when they've left armed groups. There's a political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas that, again, pushes forward the understanding of what is an acceptable norm of behavior when deploying explosive weapons. So there's no shortage of guidance as to what needs to be done. It's the implementation that is the challenge. And that's what we continually come up against. It does feel like we've reached a crunch point when the main global champions of the rights-based approaches, the international rules-based system, this phrase we often hear, are so blatantly ignoring them. And this is not just the Middle East, but I think the Middle East is probably the location that's galvanizing the global schism and discord at the moment, because there's this lack of application. When I talk with my colleagues in Beirut and Jerusalem about coming to New York or to Geneva to talk about accountability and international law, understandably, they're deeply skeptical. And they will scoff and they'll say, well, why are you doing that? What's the point? And within organizations like War Child, and I dare say Save the Children and our peers, we have this challenge between our commitment and our attempt to maintain a belief that there are rules and an application of those rules with the reality of what our staff are seeing on the ground. But I think, and Anne's presentation this morning gave us a very powerful impetus to not give up on the application of law. I don't think I don't have the luxury of saying these things don't work. I'm not in a situation of armed conflict. So the opportunities to work with the parts of the system that are working, and I think the ICC, the ICJ, are the locations where we're seeing child rights and human rights in these situations most profoundly being represented. In other places, we're not. I would also say, in terms of who, powerful states, I think, are the deadlock at the Security Council is demonstrating that powerful states are having an extremely difficult time of being very progressive. But it's the middle-sized states that have been extremely progressive over the last decade, especially with soft law instruments. So it's the likes of Argentina, Ireland, Canada that have created these soft law instruments and are proving a bit of an engine of progressive thought on child protection in conflict. Yeah, there was an excellent discussion this morning about double standards and hypocrisy and in international law. So it's not as if these issues aren't being discussed.
Well, speaking of soft law, double standards, hypocrisy, we, of course, Anne brought up the Secretary General's list of shame. We also had the Security Council session on children in armed conflict, and there's also now an established office in the UN that focuses specifically on children in armed conflict. I'm wondering, I'll turn it to you, Michael. Do any of these matter? Are they making a difference? How did we get here?
I think they matter a great deal, and I think they're making a difference, even though at the same time we can be frustrated with some of the things that are happening with some of these institutions. Just in terms of how we got here, I think it's a great story about civil society advocacy, right? So a growing consensus that something about this issue was wrong, notwithstanding the fact that under the IHL, the International Humanitarian Law rule, 15 was the minimum, below 15 was the age written into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that something more was needed. A very, very influential study by an amazing Mozambican lawyer, Graça Michel, then led to a series of of real changes in how the issue was taken up. Both we've heard about the instruments themselves, so the drafting of a new optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, raising the minimum age. We know about the Security Council and its list of shame. I think a few other things that are worth mentioning are just and I guess you've already mentioned the establishment of the office in the Secretary General, an office within the Office of the Secretary General to focus on this issue. And so I think the combination of legal instruments, strengthened legal instruments, and greater political spaces focused specifically around this issue has made a tremendous difference. Now, the list of shame, every year, there are some countries that aren't on it, right? And those aren't on it for political reasons. And Human Rights Watch, for example, will release an annual sort of like review, like who's missing. So each year it changes a little bit according to the whatever of the moment, the political considerations of the moment. And that said, it is incredibly useful that we have this thing, that we have these grave violations. One thing that I didn't mention in terms of a gap in my last round, but is actually interestingly covered by this list of shame or by the Security Council reporting in general, is that it considers situations not just armed conflict as defined in the sort of like IHL sense, but also situations like Haiti, right? This is not an armed conflict, and we don't want it to be called one for a lot of reasons, but it is very, very much like an armed conflict in that gangs control effectively most of the country, or at least most of the capital, right? With tremendously horrific consequences for children and for adults. I think the inclusion of these kinds of things on a sort of like, we might as well consider these situations because they are of comparable gravity is also incredibly useful. Yeah, I mean, I think, we would certainly like to see a lot more engagement from the office within the Secretary General's office, and the list of shame, of course, a little bit more consistency. But the fact that we have these institutions can be great. I guess one final thing that I was thinking as we were talking was there's a sort of like maybe very weak compliance pull or a sense that we don't appreciate very often about the impact of saying what the law is and saying so really, really firmly. And I'm thinking about the times that I was at Amnesty when I would come across a report that, not in the context of armed conflict, but about torture, and somebody would have captured a general saying, don't beat them because Amnesty will complain to us. Or I read a reference in the context of US family separation, where a journalist quoted an anonymous source, a government official, saying, man, those guys are going to The Hague and I'm not going to testify for them. Now that's not realistic, right? But the fact that somehow there's permeated this idea that, an institution like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or Watch List or whoever will complain, or that maybe they might have to be hauled before an international body, even if it's very, very, very unlikely, suggests that what we're doing here, even though it can feel very, very incremental, piecemeal, flawed at times, still has a considerable measure of difference.
Thank you, Michael. I want to talk about the children. What about the children, right? That's what we child advocates are always saying. So Allison, you talk a lot about intersectionality. And of course, all children are vulnerable in the context of war, but some children are even more vulnerable than others. You might have children with disabilities. You might have children who have been racialized. You might have children who belong to minority ethnic groups or cultural groups. When you try and take an intersectional approach to children in the context of war, does the child's cultural rights impact that intersectionality at all? Is there an intersectionalism that is especially necessary or amplified in the war context or the armed conflict context?
I think it's pretty clear that children who have disabilities definitely face greater challenges to the protection of their rights, and that there's inadequate attention paid to ensuring all children are lacking access to healthcare and so on, but the the impact on the children is much greater. So children who face double discrimination, I think definitely it should be recognized. And in a way, the children with disabilities ought to have protection under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and under the Hague Conventions, but there isn't the point about this this theory about intersectionality is that the law is inadequate because children who need greater protection fall between these different instruments. They can invoke them, but their situation, their plight is not adequately dealt with through the law. And when we talked about the child soldier campaign, it was mostly boys who were affected by that, and some girls were, but they were more likely to be victims of being into forced marriages or sex slavery. So this term is a bit awkward, but the girl child, certainly, the Convention on the Rights of the Child seems to pertain more to boys, whereas CEDAW is more about adult women. So the girl child is an example of a group that is more vulnerable, and particularly, I mean, especially in times of armed conflict. So I suspect there's probably data about that, but it might have some practical implications, such as where children stay during armed conflict. So if girls are more vulnerable to sexual violence, for example, then there's always been a concern about children not being housed or put with adults. But in cases where girls are more vulnerable or children with disabilities, their protection while they're being detained or it ought to be receive some attention. I'm hoping that we might talk about what are possible solutions that we could suggest. And one thing that occurred to me when Ann Skelton was talking about solidarity and the coalition building, when different bodies look at their jurisprudence of others, is that this trend towards more issuing joint recommendations. It's not intersectional, but it's a joining together to share. And so that there was a joint recommendation of the Committee on the Rights of the Child with the CEDAW committee that dealt with the rights of children concerning harmful practices. And during Black Lives Matter, some of the special rapporteurs issued joint statements. So I think in addressing problems, that could be important. And also, I'm wondering how children are consulted in addressing the topics that we're covering. How can we ask them better how to address their needs in these circumstances? And since I'm in law and society as my main field, when you're talking about the threat of an amnesty or the Hague, we talk about bargaining in the shadow of the law. So invoking the law is itself a kind of form of a sanction, or it can be used strategically. So I thought that was very interesting. And just one last thing, which is I wanted to mention, because again, Ann Skelton brought to my attention a case that was just issued October 7th, a decision by the Committee on the Rights of the Child concerning the rights of children. It's not about armed conflict, but it's about protecting their lands. And 3 Sami children brought this case, and the committee found that that Finland, in allowing mining to go forward, violated their rights to their territory and their land. So children can be empowered by invoking their cultural rights, and maybe we need to listen to them more. They're not on the committee. I don't think there are any children on the committee yet. The other thing that I just want to say, that we keep talking about what's the correct age of children. And I think in some countries, they don't have birth certificates. And so I guess I'm wondering, isn't that something that we should problematize? And children mature at different rates. And I think all people should be protected in armed conflict. I care about children too, but I think we just have to stop using killing as a way to solve problems.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that I want to applaud the International Criminal Court, particularly the prosecutor's office, that they have put a tremendous amount of time and energy into consulting with children prior to undertaking some of these prosecutions, and that they have worked very, very hard to develop child-friendly procedures, both child victims as well as child witnesses. And so there is the ability to ensure child participation, both in preparation for some of these efforts, as well as how they are carried out, especially when they are guided by what the children have recommended would help them to feel safe, and for this to be a restorative process for them rather than a compounding the trauma that they've already experienced, which many of us know happens in many justice systems, that children experience compound trauma when we try and seek justice on their behalf, when we haven't really partnered with them. So I want to applaud the ICC's prosecutor's office for doing exactly what you're talking about. There's definitely, the right to identity that's written into the CRC, and there is a movement in many countries, including Southern African countries, that Anne's been a part of, with regard to trying to make sure that children get birth documents so that their identity is protected and is enshrined in the public's consciousness, and that they have a right to citizenship, et cetera, and so on. And I know that armed conflict can affect those things. I have a question for Ioana, which is really in response to Allison's call for solutions. That in fact is something that your consortium is answering. You're answering that call. And yet when you talk about it and you say, okay, well, this is beyond law, this is religious values, this can be political identities, this can be, traditional practices, et cetera. And it encompasses so much. You're going to be subject to the criticism. Aren't you just being really idealistic? Isn't this just being really utopian? Is this really a path of hope? And can you tell us how and why this is brought down to making a realistic, tangible difference in the lives of children who are affected by armed conflict?
Thank you so much for this question. I'm going to try with the microphone again. It's a really good question. So when you can't even achieve compliance, why go beyond compliance, right? Makes total sense to me. So what I'm saying is that if you look on the ground, you see that what works is beyond compliance. And I'm going to give you two examples, concrete examples where the life of children was bettered by beyond compliance approaches. One of them is from the Philippines, the group that is called the More Islamic Liberation Front, that was engaging with UNICEF and successfully removed children that were recruited and used, including not just as child soldier, from its ranks. And they have done so only after the ulama in the Bangsamoro region has rewritten the IHL and human rights law provisions through an Islamic perspective. And by doing so, they legitimized it for the group to engage with UNICEF and to work towards rehabilitating and reintegrating children. So the law played a part, but it was really the religious translation by the ulama that has made this possible at a specific time in the conflict, when the MILF actually wanted to sign a peace agreement with the government. And that's really important. We tend to think that the law explains everything, and as positivist lawyers, that's wonderful, but that's what's utopian. It's actually economics, political, some legal aspect, social aspects that really explain things and the interaction between them. The second example that I have for you, which I can't actually mention the armed group because it's a personal example. I'm engaging with some of them. But so, and this links back to the question that you asked, do they fear the ICC? Do they fear the law? So they don't there is an awareness of the listing process, of the list of shame, in this case with this armed group. But it's the realization and the reflexivity within the group itself, the non-state armed group itself, that their own commanders of the armed wing were child soldiers, and how their future was decided by that, and how they want to see their community, including their own children, not go down the same path. So it's quite extraordinary to see this kind of reflexivity within an armed group. And that's why they want to engage on rehabilitation. And their priorities are, how do we build universities and schools in a horizon of them seeing themselves possibly as part of a future government of this specific country. So again, you would never think about the non-state armed groups doing that, right? But reality shows you that they do. As reality shows you that very knowledgeable, extremely trained and extremely well-trained and extremely well-financed, so well-structured armed forces interpret the law, IHL, in such a way that produces catastrophic harmony on the ground, right? You can't explain that with lack of knowledge. You just can't. So it's the law. I think we need to assume a certain humbleness that we can't solve things just with the law and at macro level. And we need to just accept that those on the ground are usually the ones that solve the problems, really. As much as I love Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they're not the ones on the ground always. It's the small human rights defenders, it's the small humanitarian organizations, it's the religious leaders that have some problematic interpretations, but at the same time, they're the ones with access to communities, they're the ones that can bring in the canned food, they're the ones that cross the rivers on floats and so on. It's not really the big humanitarian organizations. So I think a bit of humbleness within our own profession will allow us to focus on compliance, but also understand the many other calls for restraint of violence and abuse by various armed actors.
Thank you, Ioana. Let me take some questions from the audience.
Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Michelle Sicard. I'm a second-year master's student at Johns Hopkins Studies, studying conflict in the Americas and security and organized crime. This is a question directed to all of you. You touched on the armed groups' recruitment of children. What happens, or how can human rights law address when these children are voluntarily participating in these groups, and what is that, how do you make that distinction? And in the case of Colombia, I'm half Colombian, and I see that economic opportunity a lot of the times is the reason why children will go into communities like the FARC and the ELN. So if you could address that, and also specifically for you, Ioana, how can you address barriers to government when it comes to addressing beyond compliance method? I do see that there sometimes is resistance from governments to strictly follow the law, and so if you have any experience with that, that would be great to hear. Thank you.
I'm just going to open it up to anyone from the roundtable who'd like to answer that first question.
Well, I've written about the child soldier and the cultural circumstances that, you know, if the family and the whole community has been killed, then joining the group, it provides protection and some kind of livelihood. I think our notion of a child is a child who lacks capacity. So I guess we wouldn't worry about whether it was voluntary or not. If there's a per se rule that children should not be recruited, then the people who recruit them should be held responsible for that. And children aren't held responsible given this age distinction with the ICC. So I think it's important to recognize that children need to have alternatives so that they don't have to join groups. As far as rebel groups being held responsible, Renee Provost has written a prize-winning book called Rebel Courts that deals with how the communities follow international law, humanitarian law. In some instances, there's a chapter, I think, that is especially relevant to your question.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sarah. I'm from South Africa. I really enjoyed this panel, so thank you for taking me. A quick question for Michael. In this year being the anniversary of the Geneva Convention, there's been so many discussions about what could be worth reopening it. And I'm wondering if you would think that in any of the schools would be worth the risk of reopening the convention negotiation. And it's just a quick reflection on Ezekiel, which you shared. You made a very brief reference to the use of local customs in terms of influencing behavior of armed actors. And I just wanted to share that the ICRC in Victoria have been working on an African tool. So the tool that reflects the customs and traditions and values of African societies and how they correlate to modern-day principles of IHL. And one of them is specifically on children. So it connected a tradition from the Nuer tribes in South Sudan and the Fulani tribe in Ghana, where it says that children should not be attacked. And I wonder if that might be useful. You were talking about, mentioning the accidents in cases, perhaps using these local traditions would make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know that my colleagues will also have thoughts on this question that you've posed. I mean, I'll just say that in the discussions that eventually resulted in the Safe Schools Declaration, the document, the voluntary document I mentioned, we started by sort of suggesting that we have this new emblem. And for a variety of reasons that had to do with, like the length of time that it would take and the likelihood, or rather the unlikelihood, the extreme unlikelihood of success, we decided that this route was the better route to go. I don't know that that was, defeatism, but I think it was very practical, right? And certainly seeing the amount of time that other things took, the Declaration of the Right of Indigenous Peoples, for example, that's a whole document, but like the kinds of like years or decades in some cases of negotiating new instruments or modifying new instruments with the risk of reopening and perhaps weakening the existing standards, all that seemed like not a road we wanted to go down. And so we didn't.
Yeah, I just thank you very much for the questions. Excellent questions, both of them. I just wanted to add that on the additional emblem, I think the ICRC has just published a new report with the Norwegian Red Cross, if I'm not mistaken, that is talking about an emblem, an additional emblem for essential services such as water, sanitation, and so on. So there is discussion about that as well, but I don't think they want to open any of the Geneva Conventions, God forbid, because we're not going to get to anything close to that these days, sadly. On Colombia, I think your question is spot on. It just shows the reality on the ground. This is what we're talking about. It's not white and black. One of my colleagues at the Center for Applied Human Rights, who's part of the Beyond Compliance Consortium, works with an indigenous group, the NASA. And the indigenous group itself identifies recruitment of indigenous children as one of the main issues that they're experiencing. And that's because there is no future, there is no prospect for them. So they're working together with local government actors to address this. Now, in Colombia, the government has changed. It's used to be, I think that changed again. So a few months ago, things looked up in terms of engaging with non-state armed groups in a new peace process with the ELN, not so much with the FARC dissidents. What I would suggest is when national government doesn't work, look at the local levels. I come myself from a former authoritarian regime. Government is not just, it's a construct, right? You still have people. I'm an agentic constructivist. I like to look at the agency within the institutions. You tend to find people that you can work with in government at various levels. And I like to believe that change happens, slow and incremental. But yeah.
Can I just say that if you use an emblem, it makes it an easier target, is kind of a dilemma. And I like the idea of the local custom being used to show that there are similar ideas in different societies. Raimundo Panicar wrote an article that really influenced me, is the notion of human rights a Western concept, in which he proposes looking for these similar ideas for structural equivalence in other belief systems and value systems to see that there are shared values. In South Africa, isn't there Chima Humanga's work on Ubuntu? And showing that certain ideas are similar to human rights norms. So I think that's important. Drafting a new treaty brings people together to discuss ideas that in that process can build consensus. So I'm not, are we sure we don't want to do that?
Thank you. There was one other person who had their hand up from the beginning. So go ahead.
I'm from France. I have a question about militarization of childhood because in Russia, for example, there is UNARMIA. Since 2022, in each classroom, there is a militarization. Children at the age of 6 are taught to use weapons of war. Have you ever heard about prosecutions or criminalizations of this indoctrination crime? Because it's not only in Russia.
Anyone?
Well, I just have a preliminary comment, and maybe others will come in with the answer to your question. I mean, this kind of thing is, I think, a clear violation of the aims and purposes of education, and the guidance from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that includes sort of all of the elements of education, including that it is consistent with human rights principles, and that it is of sufficient quality, right? So at a certain point, indoctrination is also bad quality education. That's not a violation of a crime under international law. That is a state violation. So I think there would be a strong case to be made for a state violation with respect to the right to education, as well as associated rights, right? Is it really preparing children for life in society? Is it ensuring their right to development, life survival and development? But I think it's a harder question. Like in criminal law requires, I think, a more precise answer. And I don't know.
So go ahead.
I just want to make a very general comment about the trend in challenging the global norms established around what childhood is. So we've heard reference several times today to the Grasham Michelle study from 1996. It talked about children in armed conflict and reiterated what a child is and what children go through. Social norms, global norms are under constant pressure and contest. And that's a great example you gave there. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, when we engage with them, when we're able to, are contesting the idea that a child is a child. And the last 20 years of the war on terror has seen, in the phrase of one academic, unchilding. So children associated with extremist groups are seen to have forfeited their rights. So this phenomena you described is common, and some would say increasing. But I suppose just in a very general comment, it reinforces the need for the work we're doing, for the reinforcement of the global norms that have been established in all the work we do.
I think in my mind, the best response to your question is that Eglantine Jebb, 1924, climbed to the top of Mount Celeb, and she wrote 5 principles. And the 5th and final principle reads, the child must be brought up in the consciousness that its talents must be devoted to the service of its fellow men. That's really what we're talking about, is raising children to understand that they are part of this larger humanity and that we are all interconnected, and we all need to be raised to understand that interconnectedness and the need to care for one another. I was talking about resilience earlier, and what they're finding in the research around childhood resilience is that we are the healing that we need. Our love, our interactions, our relationship to one another is how we heal as human beings. And Eglantine Jebb knew that 100 years ago. that we need to raise our children to understand that we are all in service to one another. And so with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for their discussion today. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining International Law Weekend 2024.
Thank you, Warren.
Thank you.
Warren. Yeah.
I was just thinking of Article 20 propaganda of war, which was in fact introduced by the Russian Federation.
Roundtable picture together really
Yeah.
quick.
yeah,
that's great.
Huh?
You were going to say something.
Article 20, propaganda, prohibition of propaganda against war, which was actually introduced in the ICCPR by the Russian Federation. The direct violation,
You guys.
of the ICCPR.